This is Robert Clotworthy, and you are listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Here are your hosts, James McQuiston, Oak Island theorist and author, along with John Hamels, PhD and historical researcher. Get the whole story right here, brought to you by Rabbit Hole Investigations.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Oak Island Plus. I'm Doc Hamels, along with, as always,
Jim McQuiston, and boy are we happy to be here today.
We sure are. You know, this completes 2 years.
2 years, we're 2 years old.
2 years old. And you know, we haven't found any treasure yet, but we have dug into history like nobody.
Well, wait a minute, don't feel bad because they haven't found any treasure yet, and they've been at it 12 years.
So we got a ways to go.
Yeah, we got a ways to go.
I really hope they find treasure, don't you?
I
do. You know, I hope there's something that they can finally say, this is it. But meanwhile, we talk about the backstory, the history, all the things that were going on that I don't think they have time to tell. I mean, we really dig in.
Yeah.
So what's going on this show?
Well, our subject matter is going to be about artifacts.
Okay.
But before that, we have a pretty cool announcement. In addition to being here 2 years, we have new numbers
Yeah.
on our views.
Shall we share it?
Yep.
All right, here we go. You won't believe this.
What?
We broke, last week, 100,000 views.
Wow.
And that's around the world. And we're approaching 2,300 subscribers. And you know, Jim, we started this idea 2 years ago thinking we were going to do a show every week. Well, luckily we figured that out. That's way too much to do. But the fact that, you know, I thought maybe at this point in time we might have like 10,000 views. I had no idea. And I think it's testimony to your work, way before I ever came on board, of laying down theory and having content, primary sources, and then we kind of took it from there and just really dug in. What do you think?
Yep. And, you know, we called it Oak Island Plus because we thought we were going to get to other subjects besides Oak Island, but it's kind of turned around to mean this is where you're going to find the real history. Because, for instance, on the show last night, they talked about the Knights of Malta for the first time. Well, we were working on that back in 2022. And then in 2023, we had 2 episodes on it, and then I wrote a book on it.
Right.
And what's funny about it is they're going to go to Malta to try to find an answer. Port Malta is like right down the road from them on the coast, and there's a letter that Razilli wanted to make Halifax be a Knights of Malta Priory.
Right.
So, you know, somebody from up there told me once, we're never going to find it by drilling. We've drilled 400 and some holes in that hill. Some people have drilled 200 holes before that. We're going to find it in history. And I said, yeah, I know. That's what we're doing. It's in the history. And it's also in putting artifacts in context. And that's what we're going to do today in this show.
And just for those that are watching right now, if you haven't had an opportunity, if you want to go back and look about a year ago and you look for episode 12.1, 12.2, we did a 2 back-to-back shows on just the Knights of Malta and their connection to the Knights Templars, plus the relationship they had with our original story about the Knights Baronet, because basically they escorted the Knights Baronet to a degree out of Nova Scotia. So we're telling the whole story that surrounds Oak Island, but it all goes together.
And we actually placed Razilli next to Oak Island.
Right.
We have proven that he was in Mahone Bay at Gold River, and Gold River comes down and wraps right around Oak Island. And, you know, we're going to have a show on that. They used to call that area Mirligash.
Right.
And Doc pointed out, we were looking at dates, and he goes, my God, this wasn't just a flippant thing. It was there for like 130 years, this little area called
Map
Mirligash.
after map, and decade after decade. It was unbelievable. I didn't realize that.
We had maps, we had it in English, we had it in French. Then I stumbled across this German story about it, and Doc sent it to
My good friend Dr. Rudolf Kaspari over in Mellendorf, Germany, and translated it beautifully.
and I sent it over to Jack McNabb, who's from Nova Scotia that now lives in Austria, and he did his translation on it too, and we ran it through Google Translation. We have a really good translation of that German text, and so we have German, French, and English saying Mahone Bay was this area called Merligesh, and that Nicholas Dennis took Isaac de Razilli, Knight of Malta, right in there. They went up to the Gold River to see if it was navigable. And so we're going to have a whole show on that coming down the road, but this is a totally different show.
You know, Jim, getting ready to talk about now artifacts. When I was working, I had a boss, Dr. Skip Mino, and he always had a phrase about how you approach things. And I think it's pertinent today. It's called form follows function. And what we have done, and I think you've seen in the prior 23 shows, we take whatever we're talking about that we've seen either on TV or Jim has explored in person, and we reduce it down to the least common denominator of what was the function of that item in its day, as opposed to tying it to other theories that are, well, they're theories, but they're intangible. You can't bring it together quite. But I think what you're going to see today, folks, we have looked at what I would refer alternative ideas of an artifact that we're going to present that makes it to the common man. And again, form follows function. What did people need to do when they got to Nova Scotia? What did they need to do when they landed on Oak Island? And we're going to talk about those artifacts and how they used them and why.
And, you know, we admit we might not be 100% right on everything, but we are coming at it from the most pragmatic view that we can, and we're actually consulting experts along the way as we do that. So the shot you see up on the screen right there, right now, that's our show today. It's called Hard Facts on Artifacts, and you'll see that it's episode 24. This is our second birthday. And so most of the people that view the show kind of know some of what we're going to show here on the next slide. But these are what we call the critical locations. And you have Oak Island, which is in Mahone Bay. That's on that rugged coast, Atlantic coast, where you get all the waves and the storms and everything. And then you just go up the hill about 17 miles, and that's the New Ross Foundation. We did a whole show on that. I have a book on it. I think that's the first book you helped me with on. And then when you go across to the opposite side, which would be the leeward side, you have Port Royal, and that's the place where everybody wanted to live because it was calmer weather. That's the most fought after place in North America, 13 major battles right there.
Wow.
And then you jump across that Bay of Fundy to St. John, where there's a place called Fort Latour that they're doing an archaeological dig on. And what we noticed through the last year was that this red line pretty much represents the 45th parallel. It's not exact, it's just a demonstration. But Oak Island, New Ross, and Port Royal are just below that, and St. John's is just above that. And two things about that: it was considered the perfect place to live because you were halfway between the equator and the pole. But also it was mentioned in a number of deeds. We went through those. We had that map episode, and here's the 45th parallel being mentioned again. So that's where most of the activity was taking place, right in there, and that's where most of the artifacts are being found.
You know, it might be important to point out too that if you go from Mahone Bay to New Ross, if I'm not mistaken, how do you get there?
You go up over the hill and then you head to Port
Gold
Royal.
River is in there?
Well, you go right up along Gold River.
Right, and again, that was very important, and it's going to have a lot of bearing to what we're going to be talking about, is where that river comes to play on some of these things, right?
And the Fort Latour site, number 4 on this, that was owned or built by Charles de Latour, and he built that in 1631, but just the year before, he received a deed, him and his father, for the area called Merlegash, which now we know for a fact was Mahone Bay. It included Lunenburg Bay and Mahone Bay, and it looks like it might have even included St. Margaret's Bay all the way up through there. And the big significance, one of the big ones, is that was owned by 3 Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, but it was also owned by a forefather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Well, Latour Sr. was a Knight Baronet, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So this, as we've always said, this is a bigger story than Oak Island, and it's a circular story. I mean, who else took this Merlegash area and Knights Baronet and went all the way around a circle and came back to FDR, standing on the island hunting for an old family legend treasure. So
and running the whole Freemasons through that whole line.
Yep. So we'll just move on to this next slide, which is more critical locations. And this, everybody that again that's watched the show is familiar with the little elephant that is Oak Island. And so you have the money pit over on the right side there, and they're thinking they're narrowing in on where the actual money pit was. But I always call it the Money Pit Hill because it is a kind of a paved area. By now they brought so much equipment in. Just a short walk down to Smith's Cove. It's not far down there at all. The swamp, and now they've added Lot 5. I understand they paid about $250,000 for that. I think that's what the state was asking for it. And they also bought Dan Blankenship's home, which they were asking about $250,000 for. Oh. And originally they paid about $4 million for the island. Now don't quote me on all those, but it looks like they have about.
Well, they're heavily invested for sure.
$4.5 million. And then where the circle is over on the left-hand side, that's where all the activity takes place. This particular shot doesn't show it, but there's a huge interpretive center there now. And they moved the war room. They built a new one right up towards the top left.
And you visited that area this past spring,
yep,
right?
Yep.
Okay, super.
So that was just a refresher of where, when we talk about these places, you'll remember where they were. So in the interpretive center, they have a display of wood, and we'll take a look at it right here. And these are items they found that they've carbon dated and they've numbered them. And to find wood anywhere is not a big deal. What's a big deal is if you find it at depth and there's no explanation for it being down 20 feet or whatever, and also if it's human worked wood.
Right.
So a few items on this shot right here, you could say, well, that looks like it was worked by a human. There also appeared to be a few pieces of charcoal. And when Laird was on our show, he said that that's what he always wanted to find was charcoal, because he said that's like a moment in time. Like you have a fire for 1 day or 2 or 3 days at the most, whereas the wood could have laid there for 70 years before somebody picked it up and made a product out of it.
And we've said right along, a lot of that wood could be just washed in from wherever,
In fact, he said that about the swamp. He said that he has to take all that with a grain of salt because it could wash in on the tide. And even Tony Sampson told us when he was on our show, he said there's 100 shipwrecks out there along the ocean. Now that road that goes by the swamp, that wasn't there before the 1930s. And so the bay water could come right into the swamp and bring all its debris with it. And in 2016, I went up there in 2017, but during that winter season, that road washed out. And Charles was telling me about it, and he said that cost them $10,000 to rebuild that road right there. So if you let Mother Nature go for 100 years or 200 years or whatever, you're not going to have a road. You're going to have a swamp fed by bay water and by springs and lots of junk washing in there.
Storms up there.
That might be really why they're finding what might be cofferdams and stuff, because people were just trying to stop their area from being damaged.
Again, going back to foreign follows function. You got this water coming in. What do? You build a wall. Just like they were talking about last night, with that all those huge rocks and things like that. It makes perfectly good sense.
So, obviously wood is one of the better sources for carbon dating.
Right.
Like Laird said, the charcoal is, but that's kind of where I got started on my research, because I knew about the Knights Baronet because my distant cousin is currently the premier Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia, but I didn't even know their history. I didn't know when they were there or anything. I just didn't know, and I wrote them whether they had ever heard of the Knights Baronet. And so they were asking a ton of questions, which resulted in my first 2 books. But I thought, well, what other evidence is there? So I started looking at the earliest carbon dating that there was. And right here on the screen, you'll see these are the first 3 carbon dating records. And they were kind of a combination of Fred Nolan and Dan Blankenship cooperation to get these sent out. And the first one just deals with a few pieces of wood that dated back to 1575, plus or minus. And so the second one, that is the stakes from the swamp. Fred found 60 of them.
Wow.
And so what I did was I color-coded the 3 items that were tested, and then I drew a bar chart of them, and they only crossed over in one area, which was 1620 to 1660. That's the little green box you see there. So I thought, well, there's a window where all 3 carbon dates would match. So why not look at what the history of Nova Scotia was? Well, lo and behold, that's when the whole thing started.
Right.
That's when the whole thing started with William Alexander. So then they pulled up this chunk of axe-cut wood from the money pit, and it was dated back to as old as 1626. So I revised my chart a little bit. I color-coded that in black. But that still gave me from 1626 to 1660. And turns out the Alexander family said that they were at New Ross from 1623 through probably 1654. They showed up in Virginia at a place that's now Alexandria, Virginia, named for their family. They showed up there in 1656, but we think they were burnt out by the English before that. And so narrowing that window down, halfway between 1626 and 1660 happens to be 1634, which is getting real close to our target date. Well, Gilbert Hedden, who has to be my most favorite Oak Island owner ever, Doug said that he just kept records on everything. And I read some of them, and he was in great detail, just talking about drilling and what they were finding and everything. And he wrote a letter to FDR, bring up him again. He said that he felt it was dug, the money pit, in 1635.
Wow.
And then he wrote to a fan a few years later. He gave the date of 1630. Now, why he gave 2 different dates, I don't know, but it doesn't really matter to me, because the halfway point again between 1630 and 1635 is 1632 and a half, which is the summer of 1632, and that fits my theory that it was created between April and September of 1632. Why? Because that's when the Knights of Malta, Isaac de Razilli and his troops kicked out the final settlers of the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, and that's documented. It's documented in a treaty and in writings from Razilli, and that's when Razilli went into Mahone Bay. So he arrived September 10th, so they had to be out of there by September 10th.
Right.
So they would have had from April to September 10th to be on Oak Island or in Mahone Bay somewhere. And the kind of the kicker was that this Mason Square that they found dated to as old as 1632. Now, I know it could be not quite that old, but I love that date, you know. And so I realized, well, now not only the history of the creation of Nova Scotia under the Knights Baronet and all that, and the carbon dating, early carbon dating, are pointing to that time period. Well, Gilbert hadn't pointed to that time period, and he did it through surveying techniques and the drift of magnetic north compared to geographic north. So now you got three different disciplines. You got history, you got carbon dating, and you got surveying techniques, all pointing to the same time period. And that's why I'm so darn confident that that's the target period that everybody needs to be looking at.
And this T-square would have been a tool of either the Navy or those that were working on the island or in the surrounding Nova Scotia to build things and square things up, whether it's housing or working on the ship, or it was a tool.
Yep.
Everyday tool.
And that's a good point you're making there, is that all the ships had their own set of carpenters on, because they were constantly repairing the ships.
Oh, gosh,
because they
yes.
would get damaged by the sea or a shoal, or the mast would break. You know, they marked a lot of trees with that goose step.
Yep.
That they would see a tree as they're going along and say, well, that would make a good mast. Mark that so nobody will cut it down. So when we need a mast, we'll go over and get that. So Doc always says we stay in our lane, and our lane is this early development of Nova Scotia. And guess what? That was driven by the fur trade. It was particularly the beaver.
Huge.
Fur trade. It was a monopoly that was shared both by France, a Frenchman, and a Scotsman. And we'll go to this next slide and we'll talk about it a little bit.
You know, Jim, when I read up on the fur trade of the beavers, I always thought, well, you know, maybe they're taking a few hundred a year or whatever. They were talking like 20, 30,000 pelts a year.
Yep.
I go like, who's wearing all these? It was like the in thing in Europe. Everybody wanted these.
Yeah, and I did some research on it and found out that the reason they wanted the beaver fur to make felt out of, so they could make felt hats, was it was thicker and it was sturdier. Once you did it in a wet process to hammer it down and move all the fibers together, but then once you formed it and let it dry, you had a nice stiff top hat, you know. And so this next slide I call it Leave It to Beaver, just for a joke, but the beaver fur from the North American forest became a major trade item, and the French arrived in 1604. They moved into Port Royal in 1605, and they were directed by this guy, Amar de Chase, and we had him in our Knights of Malta episode a year ago. And he was a commander of the Knights of Malta, but he also was given exclusive monopoly of the beaver fur trade. So that's how important they thought it was. They picked the commander of the Knights of Malta, and hey, you get to call the shots.
You know, let me put a little footnote here. The Knights of Malta were there really early, even before the Knights Baronet were there, right?
Yep.
And that's going to be interesting for folks to watch on the Curse of Oak Island as we begin to watch how the Knights of Malta played a bigger role, as we've already discovered and shared with you in our episodes, than anybody has talked about on TV, as far as I know.
Oh, absolutely.
They were there long before.
And so then on the right-hand side, you can see William Alexander. We've used that picture a few times. He was also given a monopoly by the British government. So now you got two competing monopolies, and you have two competing knighthoods.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And this is real-life history. This isn't just some novel or something. No. This is actually what happened. And he got Nova Scotia in 1621. So what was interesting was he had a friend, William Vaughan, who owned property up in Newfoundland. And yes, he's absolutely related to Anthony Vaughan of the Money Pit history. I did all the work for my, I think it was Oak Island Mayflower book. And they had both written what they called the Golden Fleece, that they were going to America for the Golden Fleece. And I thought it was just a literary expression, like, you know, we're going to go and we're going to get
rich.
Guess what? When you clean up a beaver pelt, it's gold. You can see on the left-hand side here, the bottom, that's an actual known hat of a member, a lady that was on the Mayflower. It's in the Pilgrim Museum in Plymouth, and guess what? It's got a nice tan gold color to it. Right next to that is that's what a beaver coat looks like when it's cleaned up. Now, when we see them, the few times we see them in nature, they're all wet and they're muddy and everything. And my first thought is, who would ever want to wear anything made out of that? But it's gold. Sometimes they would dye them black. Like you can see a chart here of the different styles hats. We've seen these hats in all kinds of old movies.
Oh, yeah.
The Admiral's hat that goes sideways. And they would just dye those black if they wanted to give some oomph to them. But the beaver pelt business basically established Canada and the northern part of America because they kept depleting the resource. And then they had to move west, and they would deplete the resource. And they moved west until they got all the way to the Pacific. So it drove westward expansion for sure, but what I read was that beaver pelts from the cold weather, particularly like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, were highly prized because the pelt was thicker, the fur was thicker.
Sure, it makes sense.
Yeah. So that's why it was so intense there, and a lot of it took place in Mahone Bay, from beaver caught up at what's now New Ross, brought down what's now Gold River, and we believe traded on Oak Island.
And I think we also have to remind folks that was probably the number one item that they were after, but fishing was huge, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the two industries were gigantic. They brought back tons and tons of cod and eels and all sorts of different kinds of fish back to their home countries, and they dried them, they salted them, they did whatever, they cured them, and that was because they were out fishing or whatever you call it, depleting the waters around their countries. Right. So this place was like a gold mine for all these things.
And just to show how important this trade was, William Alexander, right below his photo there is his coat of arms from that 1634 painting.
Here he is.
And he is the first man in history to have a beaver added to his coat of arms. Now, it's not easy to get a new ornament for a coat of arms because these are steeped in the history of heraldry.
Yeah.
And so he had to pull some strings. Of course, he was close to the king, but he had to pull some strings to get that put on there. And I told you about that episode where after he died, there was a kind of a derogatory eulogy about him, and the guy actually called him, we all know that he was Night Beaver, which Doc right away said Night Fever, but they were making the point that his whole life was revolving around this beaver trade because that was money.
And think about this, that he gets this heraldry designed. We just said how important the beaver trade was, and now that's his symbol, and only him.
Yep.
I mean, that's like huge that the king would award you that. That's pretty interesting when you think about that.
So we know for a fact, and this is something maybe we're kind of more discovering ourselves, but it's been known to historians. I was just talking to a big historian last night who was talking about how he's been so fascinated by the beaver trade, how it just swept right across the nations like this, chasing the money that they could get out of it. So we're going to come to our basically our first specific artifact right now. And back in the old days, we'll put that slide up there, you get a look at it. Back in the old days, Fred Nolan found 60 similar stakes in the swamp. And recently they found maybe, I don't know, half dozen or more.
Oh, yeah.
And they all seem to come close to matching. And twice on the show now, for whatever reason, they've dated these to 1575, plus or minus. But, as I showed you in the beginning, that was for two random pieces of wood. The one that was specifically for the stakes is shown on the right-hand side of this slide right here, and it says very clearly 1700 plus or minus 80 years. Well, that fits our schedule because that takes it way beyond 1632, but it also fits other theories, but it does fit in there. And the little box in the center, that's the one for the chips of wood that were 1575. So Fred had these in a museum, and the first thing I thought of is, why would you put a peg on the end instead of a point?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going into softer ground like a marsh or something, you probably would want a peg so it doesn't keep
Right, it would rot
drifting
off
down.
pretty easy. Yeah.
So this photo I actually got from Doug Kroll. It had a chunk cut out of the middle that they sent in for carbon dating. I never did hear what their carbon dating on it was, but I just filled that center in with Photoshop to get it back to where it was. But that's roughly what they all look like. And again, this is cleaned up. When they pull them out of the swamp, when we've seen them pull them out, they're all, black from the muck of the swamp. So we know for a fact that they were found there. They're very similar in nature. They date to 1700 plus or minus 80 years. And so the big question is, what the heck were they for?
Right.
And, we thought, well, we've been doing a lot of work with surveying. We talked about the H.O. stone, and we thought, well, maybe they're kind of
Possible.
some kind of survey markers or whatever. Well, just as things happen to happen, I was given a talk to 25 archaeologists a week ago.
No pressure there.
Yeah. And one of them was a gentleman. I'm going to show you him on this next slide here. And by the way, we're going to try to get him on our show. He's already agreed to it, but we don't have any dates or anything yet. But his name is Leon Sam Briggs, and he is a Seneca elder. But more importantly, he is the spiritual advisor for a group of people called the Métis, yeah. And just coincidentally, as often happens, Doc was finding things about he's been looking into the Mi'kmaq, but he found this other group of people called the Métis, and what they are is that, there's obviously a mixture of culture. And the Acadians were a group of French people from a certain part of France, and in some cases they married into the indigenous tribes, but they kept their French paternal type of culture. Not true with the Métis.
And the Métis, the word itself means like a blending, of cultures. And when we researched and I looked into some of the very first Métis, if you will, that were born, it was around in the early 1600s. Yep. And it was Native Americans, First Nations, Mi'kmaq, marrying into, with European French. They would have offspring. Native American First Nations with Scottish, and on and on. And all these Métis, if you will, were sort of like in their own world. They were neither Native American nor were they European. And this goes from coast to coast, all the way across Canada. And this is a very, very interesting part of the history of Nova Scotia in its own right.
And the thing about it is the Métis are one of 3 recognized indigenous groups.
Yes.
Because see, what happened was, say it was a Scotsman or a Frenchman that married a Mi'kmaq or any other
another tribe.
native.
Yeah.
They absorbed into that culture.
Right.
They did not say, okay, we're going to be French at our house or we're going to be Scottish at our house. They said, we're going to be indigenous with your house. And that's how it all developed. And so Leon gave me 2 clues that were just huge. We were already working on this. We thought we had our show done, and I had to readjust it. But the first one was about the stakes. And I was talking about how we thought they might be survey stakes. We weren't sure, but we're trying to sort that out. And he said, the Seneca Nation has tons of those stakes. He said, we used them to hold logs in place to dug out canoes.
Least common denominator.
Yep.
Form follows function. They use this for everyday work.
So we happen to find two illustrations right below that paragraph you'll see here where they're on stakes, holding up the boat as they build it and clean it out. And then they just they do this near the water, so they can just push it off those stakes into the water, launch it like they've launched the big ships from a shipyard. And the other thing that they could be used for is for these wooden walkways through marshy areas. And we have two photos of that. One appears actually to be kind of Europeans or Vikings or something building one. But then and those stakes look identical. They're just crisscrossed, and then the plank is put over them. And I don't know if you know, but up there to Presque Isle Lighthouse, there was a walkway through the marsh. You'd go across the bay, and you'd walk through the marsh on one of these walkways, just like this, to get to.
For our viewers from around the world, where's Presque Isle?
Yeah, it's in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Just down the road from here.
And they got a giant, beautiful lighthouse there. And they're trying to preserve that walkway. They even made the sidewalk look like the walkway as best they could, because it's such a part of the history.
Okay, let's take a moment now. Just think about the Oak Island, Curse of Oak Island, and what they found in the last few weeks. They found stakes, and remember they found a pile of planks.
Yeah.
So, again, this is an alternative concept, but why couldn't that be a walkway made out of planks with those stakes to go through the, as now Rick calls it, the bog? It's no longer the swamp, it's the bog.
Yeah. Well, and so you might think, well, why do you want to walk out there? Well, you may want to launch your canoe off that walkway. Right. You may want to fish. If you have a fishing weir, which is what we're going to talk about next, you can walk out there, keep your feet dry, work getting the fish out of the fish weir.
And if you study Native American life in that area, in this, when the weather got nicer, they would come down from inland and they would go to the mouth of the rivers and they'd fish, and that's where a lot of this activity would take place. And that's why I mentioned about Gold River, because that's right in Mahone Bay. And then when the weather got worse, cold and so forth, they would go inland, and then they would live in their other arrangements.
Hunt moose or some other animal
exactly.
up there. So they got a varied diet depending on the weather. And we've confirmed that with not only in a ton of books, but also with Laird. He agreed 100% on that. So, and then one probably less potential thing that you could do from it is you could hunt beaver. And one thing you got to realize is that they did not have traps back then. And on that 1634 painting that I found, and we tore it apart, they're chasing them with clubs and spears. They're not trapping them, they're hunting them down. So what a better way to do it than to be walking out on a plank over their dam building area, and you just reach over the side with your club and take home a prize.
So where on Oak Island would a beaver live?
In the swamp.
Sounds logical to me.
So there's three practical reasons for those stakes right there. There's also the surveying aspect of it.
Right.
Somebody said maybe they're fence posts, and there was a fence along there. But this is very practical, and Mr. Briggs said, believe me, he said Seneca Nation has a ton of those stakes from the past of making dugout canoes. Now this guy, he's just not nobody. He has worked from Quebec all the way down to the Jamestown colony on dig sites. Guess what? He consulted for Laird Niven when they found the Mi'kmaq bowl along the Stone Road.
Really?
Yep. One thing that a lot of people don't know about that is that they found a lot more than that bowl. If you just watch the show, it looks like they shut it down.
Just a couple of little things, yeah.
But they found arrowheads and hide scrapers. And I was up there in 2021 on the day that Jack found another arrowhead, because somebody come in we were in that archive center. Actually, I think we were eating lunch, and Doug was in there, and Steve Guptill, and I think even Rick was in there. Yeah, and somebody comes in and says, Jack found another arrowhead, and somebody says, why is it always Jack finding these things? But so I believe I was told that they found 6 items. And Rick, it was a very upsetting time for him. I got there right after they found the thing, and they hadn't been shut down totally yet because the dig site was all still there. Charles took me down to see it, but Rick told me that they were also upset that Marty and Craig were so mad they went back to Michigan, left him holding the bag, and everybody was down that day. And I thought it was because COVID was still, there were a lot of restrictions. That was 2021. It took me forever to get up there. And I thought, wow, this COVID thing is really just, wearing people out. It wasn't anything to do with that. It was the fact that they just got shut down. And I filmed that area, and Charles warned me, don't put that online. I'm sure you can't put that online. Yeah. Well, sure enough, when the show finally came on, it was all bulldozed over.
Oh boy.
I think they said, well, the heck with you. If you don't want us to help you uncover your culture, we'll just bulldoze it over. So we're going to have, I've already asked him if he would be on the show.
That'd be great.
Leon. And, he'll be such insight to the early groups of people that lived there and how they had to deal with the French coming and the Scots coming and all that. So here's another slide about the I call it walkways and weirs. Now, a weir's just a fishing trap. And down in the left-hand corner, you'll see kind of what a typical weir would be. The fish come in to like a funnel area, and they get stuck in there. They can't figure out how to get out, and then you go in and catch them by hand, usually. They're in a shallower water, and a lot of times this is done when the tide comes in.
Right.
And then as it goes back out, they leave the fish there. Well, on the right-hand side, all I did was take that initial photo we showed of Oak Island, and I just cloned off the road. With no road in there, this is the bay going right into there. Perfect spot for a fishing weir. They're going right in, getting funneled in, and getting trapped there. And all that stuff they found at what they call the eye of the swamp, that, I'm guessing, was the actual fishing weir.
Why not?
Area. They'd get that far into that weir and they couldn't get out. And then they'd walk the walkways.
So you take a series of stakes, you position them correctly, and this is just not in Nova Scotia, Oak Island area. This was a very common practice around the world. I've seen fishing weirs, and like you said, it's sort of like a minnow trap. If anyone knows what it is, it's a very very narrow opening in there, and they go in, but they can't come back out because of their gills and their fins and stuff. And they also would use spears, like a forked spear for eel. And we talked about this the other day. Eel trade was huge as well, and it was very much considered a delicacy, and they shipped those things out. And so those eels would get into these weirs as well.
And back when they made their first trip there in 23, the principals from that ship went back on a different boat. They loaded that particular boat, it was the St. Luke, they loaded it up with fish, and they took it to Portugal to sell it in Portugal. And they don't know how long that hung out. Somebody wrote that it hung out along the coast for 4 months. Well, if they built New Ross, they know the ship was there for 4 months. You could go to New Ross, you could park in Mahone Bay, you could go up there and build, at least get the thing started.
Certainly.
Up there before you take off with a ship full of fish to head to Portugal, and all of that would have been practical.
And building a little structure.
Yep.
For smoking the fish, or for getting out of the elements, not going back and forth to the ship. Also having small wharves so that they could bring in their smaller boats to come in and bring the fish back to the main ship and so forth. I mean, these, like we said, it's just everyday things that we think they're finding.
And going back to practical things, Nicholas Dennis, when he was writing about taking Isaac de Razilli, Knight of Malta, into Mahone Bay, up to Gold River, he said, I took him to a hall that I built to have a dinner. And guess what? There's a building on Lot 5 that nobody can explain what it is, but it faces Gold River.
Multi-generational, multicultural, multinational artifacts are being found there.
Yep. What what a simple scenario. They come in, he takes them over to Gold River, says, well, this is what we're dealing with
Right.
for depth, so what kind of boat do you want to try to take up there? And, oh, by the way, on that island that's right smack in front of us, I have a hall that I built there. Let's go there and we'll have a feast.
And just for a point of information, Denny's was like de Rosili's lieutenant or second in command.
And guess what else? So was Charles de La Tour. He wasn't a second in command, but Rosili made Charles de La Tour a lieutenant too.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have the guy that was deeded Mirligash or Mahone Bay in 1630, moved up to St. John in 1631. In 1632, Rosili makes him one of his lieutenants, and Rosili's in in Mahone Bay. We know within sight of Oak Island because that's where Gold River is. So, this is just crazy stuff. Oh, by the way, on this slide, we'll put it back up there for a minute. That's me in Charles' golf cart right on the road that's between the swamp and the bay, and that's the road that washed out. He said it cost $10,000. That was in 2017 winter. That washed out. And that was so cool because he took us around and then he comes back and he said, well, you know how to drive a golf cart, don't you? Because they weren't ready yet. They needed about another hour to get everybody together. And he said, you know how to drive a golf cart? You kidding? So I went everywhere that I dared go where it wouldn't get stuck. Because, golf carts aren't like four-wheelers.
No, they're not.
But anyway, I had kind of free reign of the island. Not now. Not now. You don't have it.
Those days are over.
It's locked tight. So it's just all such exciting stuff. And the biggest thing that we've found recently, and Mr. Briggs has reinforced that, but there were a lot of different groups. Like
Yes.
we've been stuck in the Scots, French, Mi'kmaq thing, which the show kind of is too. They throw the Portuguese in there once in a while. But guess what? There were tons of branches of those.
Yes.
And this next slide, again, our slides get wordy, but you can stop the screen and you can read the whole thing if you want. It's just like reading a book. And this map, this is an old, somewhat contemporary map up on the right, and I circled, they're talking about what they call Indian tribes. The Etchmans Indians is the top left. The top middle is the Mi'kmaq. The middle one is both Mi'kmaq and the Iroquois.
Interesting.
And then the lower left, that it says Cape Sable Indians. Well, I looked this up, and they think that they were Mi'kmaq.
Okay,
They
like
were
a subset type thing.
Mi'kmaq. So we already have evidence, as I was saying, about Mirligash. We have it in English, French, and German language, along with contemporary maps, and that's going to be a show here in the near future. And as I said, Doc pointed out, oh my gosh, it was there for 130 years. Now, that's a long time,
Right.
you know. So I found a note that there was a French account from a Jesuit states that living at Mirligash in the 1600s were several Indians and Metis, which means even back then they were dividing the two.
Yeah.
There were you might say, pure indigenous people, and the other group were the ones that had married in.
Right.
They were still
This
indigenous.
middle group, this blended group, the Metis.
Blended group, yes. And so the other nice thing about this map is it had a scale at the bottom. And so I made a red bar that would be at approximately 52 miles, because that's what the deed for Mirligash said. And it was 52 miles from La Have. And that, where you see I placed it on the map, that point that comes out is La Have. 52 miles is way past, way past Lunenburg, Mahone Bay, and those three little fingers you see there of those bays. That's Lunenburg Bay, Mirligash Bay, and St. Margaret's Bay. It's almost to Halifax. That was the whole area. Yeah. And that was what was there for 130 years. And it's mentioned, and it has such a unique name that you could write a whole history just about that name and about the documents and maps. And that's what we're going to do in one of our shows. So the actual deed, this is where I started with knowing how far that was. The deed is recorded actually in Massachusetts deed book, because they were kind of under the wing of Massachusetts at the time. It was written in French at Covent Garden, London.
Mm-hmm.
It was notarized by 3 notaries. It was witnessed by our buddy Al Strachan.
The thief.
And yes, and when they transferred it into the deed books in Massachusetts, they rewrote it into English, had an expert do that. Then they had another expert come in and check his work, double check his work, and sign an affidavit that, yes, I feel that he has accurately transferred that deed. And this is what it said. Now they're talking about going up the coast, and they said, following along the said coast unto Merligash, near unto and beyond the port and cape of La Have, drawing forward 15 leagues within the lands and seas towards the north. So 15 leagues was 52 and a half miles. So it covers all that area. And that's 52 and a half miles, which is far beyond Lunenburg. But French explorer Nicolas Denis, who wrote a large book, I mean, these old books, they're right out there to read. They're just amazing. He describes Merligash Bay as 3 leagues deep, or 3 leagues in depth, and filled with numerous islands. Well, 3 leagues would be about 10 and a half miles, and that pretty much covers how deep Mahone Bay goes back into the land. And of course, at one time it had over 350 islands. Now, Tony Sampson told us
That's
that
underwater.
it's down to 100 and some now because of climate change. But Lunenburg, which is often said to be Merligash, is only about 3 miles deep, and it has like 1 island. So you could never, ever, nobody could ever confuse Lunenburg Bay with a 3-mile bay with 1 island with a bay that was 10 and a half miles with numerous islands. It just makes no sense whatsoever. So we're just going to review some of the groups that were there. Now, we had the religious orders because everybody brought a minister with them. In fact, the very first ship that Alexander sent in 1622 that didn't make it, one of the people on it was a minister. So the French had the Jesuits, which were kind of like administrative leaders. They had the Capuchins, which were Franciscan monks, and they were kind of worked with the people right in the community. And they had the Recollects, which were an Augustine group, and they were like contemplative. And the Capuchins were actually in 1632, that date just keeps coming up over and over again, they were given the responsibility of Nova Scotia, or in their case they called it Acadia. On paper they said, you folks are in charge there. But it didn't take long for the Jesuits and the Recollects to edge in on their territory. Then you had some Huguenot ministers, which they are Protestant, but they're a different sect type thing. And then you had just your run-of-the-mill Presbyterian and Anglican ministers that came along with the Scots.
And these are reflective of the European countries that these people hailed from, correct?
Yep. And they were a part of everybody's life because they were there trying to save souls.
Missionaries?
Yes, missionaries. Then the people whose souls they were trying to save were the indigenous people, and you have the Mi'kmaq, or that's spelled a couple different ways. And then you have the Etchmans or the Stetchmans, and they were of the Algonquin tribe. He had the Suriquois, which the French used that term for people that spoke the Iroquois language, but were not necessarily part of the 5 nations of the Iroquois. They also spelled Iroquois with a H, in some cases, Iroquois. And you had the Huron, and the Huron were very strongly allied with the French, and you see that in James Fenimore Cooper novels, all that. Well, in the actual deed for Nova Scotia, now not for Merligash, but for Nova Scotia, that John Erskine wrote, quote, "The countries of the Siraquis and Stetchmini, commonly called the Siraquois and Stetchmans," the exact what history records as being there. And then you had the two knighthoods. Again, you had the Knights Baronet, which was under William Alexander, and you had the Knights of Malta, which were leading the French settlers. And
That was Cardinal
proven.
Richelieu and his 100 gentlemen that were
100
investors,
associates,
just
yep.
like the Knights Baronet.
And then the nationalities. You had the French and the Scottish, and amongst the Scottish were some English, but they tried to keep it principally Scotland because they were trying to take pressure off Scotland because it was getting overcrowded and resources were dying away. Then you had the Acadian, which they say they came from a certain part of France, but they also did some marrying into the indigenous tribes, but they maintained
They were French. Right.
And you have the Metis.
Okay.
And they were actually principally indigenous with a little bit of
Right.
Scottish and remember on that one show we actually identified the 5 or 6 Scotsmen who stayed in Port Royal when the rest got kicked out.
You saw kind of blended into the woods.
And then the Inuit, which is there's not that much mention of them, but they were part of the Eskimo culture. So today, the three recognized First Nations of indigenous people, I should say,
Yes.
in Nova Scotia, are the First Nations, the Inuit,
Okay.
and the Metis
Absolutely.
as a indigenous group. So, and they're big. There's lots
Thousands
of
of them, yeah.
So, and it's going to be so interesting to hear Mr. Briggs talk about.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Because all of this developed because of the fur trade, and it all developed in our window of time in the early 1600s. It's all tied to that phenomenon. So this next slide. Oh, the
Another
Templar
artifact.
Cross.
An
the Templar
artifact.
Cross,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh boy.
So the Oak Island Cross was found in 2017, and their official explanation is this artifact supports the theory that the Knights Templar may have been on the island, and it tested as lead from southern France that dates back to a mine that started in the 13 or 1400s. But guess what? There was another one found over to Latour's property at St. John, and that was found the next year, and they dated that to when the fort was built, 1631. And there was another one found over in Michigan at a Jesuit fort, and they're not exactly similar, but they're similar in the sense they're a crucifix with a hole in the top to put a necklace in. Well, Doc found this little, it's a painting of Jacques Cartier, and what's he doing? He's handing a small crucifix on a chain to a First Nations chief. I actually found some quotes. Jesuit crucifixes have been found in archaeological digs all across the north. It's a common occurrence. And they might have been Recollects or Capuchin crosses because they were all part of the Catholic Church. But I actually found some contemporary references to them. One of them is, quote, "We gave a crucifix to the woman who washes our church linen."
Like a little gift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the Ursulines were nuns, and so another contemporary quote was, "The Ursuline nuns sent many beautiful New Year's gifts with rosaries and crucifixes." This other one was actually from 1632, or was writing about that. It said in 1632, friars of the province of Paris were put in charge of the mission in Acadia. The center of the mission was at Port Royal, where we always talk about
Yeah.
now Annapolis, but extended northward to the Bay of Chaleur. Well, I looked up, where's that bay? I had never heard that before. It's all the way around the tip of Nova Scotia past Cape Breton, over by Anticosti Island. It's on the mainland off Anticosti
Wow.
Island. It's all that we've been talking about, that
The
whole
whole
area.
region, yeah.
And finally, this one is kind of interesting because it shifts to the beads, because they found another bead last night, and they found beads before, and we know that was a trade item. Then, drawing out a quantity of porcelain beads, he, this native, said, "I am sorry, I am so poor, I have neither moose nor beaver to present to those gentlemen," those were the monks, "who so greatly obliged us at our baptism." So he's given them beads. So again, we go back to the fact that this was common. This is not some one-off thing that this is that one thing. This is just common daily interaction of people.
And in the research that we did, we found that they actually called them trade crosses, right? They were exchanging the crosses for things as well, maybe for beaver pelts or when they were being baptized or whatever. So these were, like you said, very common that they would give these to those that they came in contact with.
And sadly, there's not 1 ounce of evidence that a Knight Templar ever stepped foot in North America. Nobody's presented anything that's not deniable. I know some people like to, that's their whole thing, it's all about Templars.
Yeah,
but there isn't any. And
I think they've pivoted now to the descendants of the Templars, and I think that's us.
that's they got that from us. We're sure of that. So here's some alternative explanations. First of all, they're probably crosses made on the spot, cast in lead in either a sand mold or a woodcut mold.
Easy to do.
And because lead has a low melting point and it's very pliable,
right,
and it's cheap.
And reusable. We talked about they could have used old bullets or casings or whatever.
And my question right from the beginning is, why would a Templar ever be caught dead with a cross that looked that rough? They had access to silver. They had access to gold.
This was like a common person's.
Yeah, this was a common person's cross for good luck or religious purposes. And yes, the lead could be from that mine, but who knows when it was actually mined. You know, that's just when the mine started. But also, I found this pretty amazing. 50% of all lead in use today is recycled lead. It's the most recycled material because of the fact that the common man can recycle it. And and we also found out that although Charles de La Tour was not a Metis himself, he associated with them. Doc found some really cool stuff that we'll try to get into at some point of people that were living at his communities and corresponding with him. Now he kept the French. I'm a Frenchman. He had a indigenous wife, right? And
yeah, and they had children. Metis.
Yes. So, and then we know that he became a lieutenant of Knight of Malta Isaac de Razilli, who we know visited Mahone Bay and Gold River, which is very close to Oak Island, and it was right around 1632. It wasn't specifically dated, but that's when they got there.
Right.
And Razilli died by 1636, so
There's a monument there.
It had to be between those years, 32 to 36. So we only have a couple more slides here. We're glad you're sticking with us, but this theme is the same through all, that these were common items that were in daily life at the time, and they don't represent a moment in time of some kind of mysterious arrival of some magnificent treasure. Now, we're not against the fact that there might have been a treasure
not at all
on Oak Island at all. But the next one we're going to look at here on this slide is the bag seal. And right off the bat, they said that was some kind of Templar design on there. There's 2 different shots of it. What it is, it's a mark of 4. You can see up towards the top, there's the symbol of a 4. And that is a common mark. It was common for Freemason marks. It was common for craftsmen. They put it on their door, on their sign. It was kind of like a poor man's coat of arms type of thing, you know, the stamp. And it was used on bag seals, which clamped bundles of cloth together. And the producer, the dyer, and the seller had to put their own clamp on it. That was the number one trade item to the First Nations for beaver. A European cloth, because they never thought to make anything like that. They're seeing all this beautiful cloth, and they're going, well, all we're doing is trading a bunch of dirty beaver for all this beautiful cloth. And that was found on Oak Island, and guess what? It's also been found on wharfs off the old Jamestown colony, and it's been found on wharfs in England. They're almost always found on wharfs, and that's because they're handling this cloth, and it falls off as they're rough handling it, or they're taking it off to sort out the cloth to say, okay, you get these two pieces, you get those two pieces. So it was one of the main items, and this bag seal represents or is similar to one that I found on this chart. Now there are several charts, but the chart in the lower left, the very bottom one at the right there, that is from Norwich, England, which is in the county of Norfolk, and Thomas Howard, their family, was in charge of Norfolk. So this is just your regular run-of-the-mill bag seal. They made them like the 17 to 1900s were when these were really prominent. They folded over and clamped it. Commonly used, there are probably thousands of them in the dirt along the...
Now keep me honest on this, but I remember reading that the mark of the four was a religious mark.
Yes.
It was the sign of the cross, as they would bless themselves.
Yeah. And there's this thing called a chirio in the Catholic Church. It looks like a P, and they think that this was a spin-off of that.
Oh, that too. Yeah, a couple different explanations.
And the same thing, because the motion of your hand going around like that would form a P. So that's where it came from, and but it just became this, like, not really secret thing, but just this cool thing to have a mark of four in your logo. So that brings us to our final item here, and again, it's thematic in the sense that the items found were in common use. They have a legitimate historical background for them, and they are not. There is nothing at all to indicate that they have anything to do with the Templars. They have to do with those beginning years of the founding of Nova Scotia by the French and the Scots. This last one, we'll put up on the screen here, this is the so-called barter token. Well, guess what? This is a hemweight, and you can prove this easily online. Right across from, at the top, there's three of them that are, they're designated as medieval, late medieval to the Tudor period, which would be where they're settling Nova Scotia. And they had two holes in the center to sew them to the material.
In one, back out the other, right?
And they had a scalloped edge to help keep them in place. And these were used in women's dresses and skirts. They were used in men's big frock coats so the tail wouldn't flop around.
Uniforms and things.
And they were used in curtains to keep the curtains down. And this one that's down in the lower left, this was actually, this gentleman was a merchant. This was found on the mainland, a little bit away from Oak Island, but in that same general area. And he had his stamp. He must have sold them or whatever, and he had it stamped with his name on it. So, and then the other thing, and I know that I've done this, I don't know if it was with a hemweight or whatever, but you have the little toy where you put the string through the two holes and you do this and the thing spins like that, you know. So again, you have a very common item used for during that same period when Oak Island was being settled. And lead has been recycled for millennia, again, because it's easy to do. There's no way to date lead. You can apparently tell where it came from. But the other thing I learned was that metal recycling, any kind of recycling, was intensified when you were under stress, and particularly in a new area where you had enemies, you did not have a lot of resources
it's very valuable
to draw from. If you have a chunk of lead, last thing you're going to do is throw it away.
Right.
You're going to either make a bullet out of it or make a utensil, a spoon, or hemweight. So our thesis, I guess you would say, is that there's a lot of items found. They could be found on other islands. Rick even said one day to me that if you threw a rock on the mainland, you'd find just as many Mi'kmaq items over there as you do over here. Mm-hmm. This is not unique. Right. What's on Oak Island is not unique. We kind of think that maybe they brought the beaver down Oak Island or down Gold River and pulled their canoes and their ship tenders right up on that stone road, mm-hmm. traded, got into powwows for the next hour or two. How many beaver are you going to give me for this piece of cloth or this trading bead or whatever? And again, this doesn't discount our idea of a treasure. This is just saying that a lot of these artifacts are common, daily utensil type things.
Well, Jim, I'm satisfied at this point that at least we came up with some other ideas. And folks, if you have comments or you know something that we don't, as always, please feel free to leave a comment, and we take those things seriously and under consideration, and we'll do further research on it. So I guess that kind of takes us to the end, but I do want to do a shout out to the folks on Facebook that have left really wonderful comments, and we thank you because we appreciate the fact that you are sticking with us, and we just had some really nice ones recently. And of course, those that follow us on our YouTube channel, thank you for subscribing, and if you want to share it with others, we do enjoy reading your comments, and again, we appreciate all that you say and do for us.
And we try to answer as many as we can. We sometimes fall back on that, but then we go back and we try to catch them all again. But we do read them and appreciate them, and we appreciate what we're learning from them, because this is all just a big learning thing. You know, we just think where we were 2 years ago.
Speaking of, we're going to sign off now. This ends our second year of historical research regarding Oak Island and Nova Scotia, and we look forward to next year beginning our third year. So I'm Doc Hamill saying thanks for joining us today, and
Jim McQuiston, let's go get some birthday cake. There's only 2 candles to blow out, so thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
This is Robert Clotworthy, and you have been listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Be sure to catch every episode.